So today is Saturday, which means it's time for another News of the Week episode. Now, Toronto FC will now be receiving the final CCL spot and will be the Canadian representative for this upcoming CONCACAF Champions League competition after the Canadian Soccer Association announced that they're going to be postponing the Canadian Championship again. Now, I know there's a lot of people that is not happy with this decision, and a lot of people are angry that TFC have now become the second MLS team that got the benefit of the doubt with their respective association in order to pretty much now get a free pass into CCL for this season. And that I know some people even say that this is even more ridiculous of how Atlanta was able to get their free pass, because at least Atlanta win something to get the benefit of the doubt, whereas TFC, their benefit of the doubt was really them getting a COVID outbreak that happened a couple of days ago that kind of forced this Canadian Championship to what was supposed to schedule for this upcoming week to now be scheduled to another day. But at the same time, I am actually going to take an unpopular stance, and I'm going to say this is not as bad as of a decision as some people think it is, because one, Forge FC, when they heard about this Canadian Championship that was supposed to be happening somewhere next week, they were definitely not happy that was the date that they're going to play the Canadian Championship, because one, they got a very short notice that was the day that they're going to play the Canadian Championship final, and knowing the fact that pretty much the Canadian Premier League have not announced their start date and no Canadian Premier League team has started preseason, that means Forge FC literally have 1 week of preseason to prepare for this Canadian Championship final, compared to TFC that has already had a couple of weeks of preseason to prepare for this game. And you probably can see how that is a huge disadvantage for Forge FC, and it's kind of not fair, the fact that Forge FC have limited amount of time to prepare compared to TFC that has already had a couple of weeks to prepare for this. Now, the second reason I will say is that, even though Forge FC is not going to be going to CCL and they lost their chances to potentially go to CCL by beating TFC in the Canadian Championship, they do get a compensation and a consolation prize in terms of hosting the Canadian Championship final. And I guess that compensation and that consolation seems to be much better than them potentially getting a CCL spot, because once Canada does allow fans to be back in the stands, there's no doubt that a Canadian Championship final that's going to be hosted by Forge and is going to be happening in Hamilton is definitely going to be higher attendance compared to a Canadian Championship final game that's going to be taking place in Toronto and taking place at BMO Field. And then I think the final reason I'll say why this isn't as bad as people think it is that now I think that two-legged affair between TFC and Lyon is going to be much more closely contested compared to if Forge FC play against Lyon. Like, I said before, where even though as much as I'd love to see a feel-good story with a Canadian Premier League team going to the CCL knockout phase for the first time in that league history, I feel like there's just no way in the world Forge is going to beat Lyon, and that they're probably going to get absolutely thrashed by Club Lyon. I mean, Club Lyon this season, they're not really having a good year in Liga MX, but they're playing against a Forge FC team in the Canadian Premier League. And I said before that the Canadian Premier League, in terms of their standard, is kind of right support around the USL Championship level. So imagine you have like a USL Championship level team facing against a Liga MX team. Yeah, that's not really a competition whatsoever, and that, again, I think Forge would have been absolutely fresh in that game, as much as it does create a good feel-good story with a historic moment of seeing a Canadian Premier League team entering the CCL knockout phase for the first time in the competition history. But either way, one thing I will agree in terms of what people have reacted to this decision is that, yeah, this is an incompetent decision by the CSA, and that the CSA literally had 6 months to decide when exactly the Canadian Championship was going to take place. And if I would have chose when exactly the Canadian Championship would have took place, I would have chose right after when Toronto got knocked out by Nashville in the playoffs. Like, they should have done it in November, where I know November in Toronto is definitely not the time you want to play a Canadian Championship final, but it's at least better than in December, January, or February, or even in March that they schedule. And that in March, the danger of scheduling now is that, you got to make sure that you play the Canadian Championship now, or else if you decide to postpone a game, or if you have this situation where one of these team, and unfortunately this was the case with TFC getting a COVID outbreak within their team, you're now going to have trouble in terms of postponing that Canadian Championship final to another day before CCL actually begin. And remember, the whole point of the Canadian Championship was to decide who exactly get that CCL spot and be the Canadian representative in CCL this season. And now it seems like that title is pretty much not pretty much something that will not be the case for this upcoming Canadian Championship. But yeah, we shall see when exactly they're going to postpone this Canadian Championship again. Again, I think most likely it's not going to be as soon as April, knowing the fact that with TFC playing their home games in Orlando and Tampa to begin the MLS season, as long as if they are going to continue to playing their home game down in Florida, there is no way in the world CSA is going to schedule the Canadian Championship while Toronto is doing that, because I don't think TFC is even allowed to be able to play a home game down in Florida and then literally on a free day rest they have to go back to Canada to play this Canadian Championship final, and then 3 days later they have to go back to the US because the whole border situation with Canada and the US, and how there's definitely some restriction where if you do cross the border into Canada, you have to go through like a self quarantine period. And I know professional team does have some exception, but I have a feeling that the Canadian government is not going to allow that to happen. But either way, moving on in terms of the next news, as I did spend a good amount of time talking about this because this was really one of the bigger news from these past couple of days. But the following news is also a big news that have just announced today, and well, it's not really news that was announced, but this is kind of in some way, I would say, depending on how you feel, this could be a surprising news, and this could maybe not be an unsurprising news. And then, of course, is Orlando City have turned down a $10 million offer for Daryl DK, and it was reported that one of the big six clubs in the Premier League was looking to try to offer $10 million to Orlando City in order to acquire Daryl DK. Now, the thing, how I said it depends on how you view this news, if it's a surprising or unsurprising kind of factor. The surprising thing is that usually when a MLS club is asked to get one of their best player and they ask for $10 million, a lot of MLS team is going to accept that, because $10 million is a lot of money in MLS as standpoint. But I also understand why maybe Orlando City did decide not to do it, and this is where I talk about the unsurprising factor, where Orlando City know that Daryl DK is definitely doing well with Barnsley. He's already scored a couple of goals in his limited appearance with the club, and they know that if he can continue to be in form, then that transfer fee is going to continue to go up. And also, it will be very interesting to see what happened when Daryl DK loan end with Barnsley, whether or not if he actually is going to stay with the club. And that decision is actually something that they need to make sooner than what people think it is, because the championship actually end their season right around late April, and when that happened, Orlando City is going to have to decide whether, if they decide to sell Barnes or sell Daryl DK to Barnsley or to another club, or they decide to bring him back. And if they are going to bring him back, it's no surprise why they to ask club for a bigger offer for him, because they don't want to lose one of their most important player. And then in some way, I could also say this is kind of like the LAFC strategy, where I talked about before, where the reason why LAFC have not sold Diego Rossi, who is pretty much their biggest asset, is that they want to make sure they want to keep their biggest asset and continue to drive up that transfer fee. And unless if they finally got the offer that they feel like is enough to sell one of their biggest asset, they decide to do so. And this feels like it's the same case with Orlando City, where they're going to keep their biggest asset until if they feel like that transfer fee that was offered by one of these big European teams seems enough for them to sell Daryl DK, then that's when they decided to pull the trigger and basically accept the offer. So yeah, we shall see how Daryl DK is going to do for his remaining time with Barnsley, but also keep an eye on whether or not if there's going to be more team, and this offer is going to be even higher than what it's originally reported that there's a couple of team, and especially one of those big six in the Premier League is offering $10 million to Orlando City in order to acquire Daryl DK. Now, moving on, the LA Galaxy have signed French winger Samuel Grenzer from AS Monaco. I kind of mentioned this in the last News of the Week episode where it was pretty close that the Galaxy was going to sign this guy, and indeed, they finally announced it yesterday. And then I also mentioned how I think he could be a decent player for this team, and I'm also hoping being that, maybe he could be kind of a Roman Alessandrini type of player where, last time when the Galaxy decided to sign a French winger from a well-known Ligue 1 club, turns out to be Roman Alessandrini, and he turns out to be a decent player. So we'll see whether or not if that is going to be the case for the Galaxy. But moving on, in terms of the next news, is that the Vancouver Whitecaps have signed Kyle Alexandra from Botafogo, and this is another news that I mentioned before in the last News of the Week, where the Whitecaps were pretty close to signing this guy, and indeed they officially announced it these past couple of days. And they did sign him to a 4-year contract, which means that this deal is a permanent signing, and that this is not like one of these deals where we see MLS team whenever they acquire a player down in South America, they usually as those the player that is currently with their club in South America on a loan deal with an option to buy at the end of the season. That's not the case in this situation. The Whitecaps, of course, is able to get him outright, and also they think he is going to be a long-term future in terms of their holding midfield spot. So yeah, we shall see whether or not if that, of course, is going to be the case. And that either way, I think this is definitely a decent signing for the Whitecaps that has already had a pretty good off season with some of the signings and some of the needs that they need to address heading into this off season. But moving on, in terms of the next news and sticking with the Whitecaps, they officially named Ricardo Clark as the assistant coach for this upcoming season, and I'm obviously very happy to see Ricardo Clark finally get a chance to begin his coaching career, because when he did retire a couple of years ago, I knew that he was definitely a guy that I can see him be embarking on a coaching career and potentially be a head coach in these next couple of years. And although he isn't going to be the head coach yet right now, and I don't think he's ready to do so, I think he's definitely ready to start his coaching career as an assistant head coach, and that I hope he's going to do well with the Whitecaps. And maybe if he is going to do well as the assistant head coach of this team, there's no doubt there's going to be some teams in the future that maybe needs a head coach, and that they might ring up the Whitecaps and maybe ask Ricardo Clark to potentially be the head coach of their team. Speaking of assistant coach that could potentially be head coach in the future, well, remember how throughout this off season and really throughout the past couple of years, there's always talk with these three Sounders assistant coach with Pineda, Preki, and Traore, and potentially one if not all three of these guys are going to be move on to another team to be a head coach of an MLS club. Well, unfortunately, it seems like that's not going to happen anytime soon, because the Sounders have just locked all three of these assistant coach to a contract extension. And I guess, knowing that they saw how there seems like a really high interest in terms of their free assistant coach, they feel like, it's great that there's high interest for our assistant coach, but at the same time, we want to keep them to make sure that they stay with this club, because they play a big part of why the Sounders has been so successful for the past couple of years, and the reason why they're kind of embarking on this dynasty run that they have been on these past couple of years. So yeah, all three of these guys are going to be staying with the Sounders as assistant coach for the time being, but I won't be surprised in the future eventually one, if not all three of these guys are going to get their chances to be a head coach of an MLS team again. There's been a lot of rumors these past couple of years that one of them could have easily been a head coach of an MLS as team. And a good example of that is just this off season where I heard, I think it was it Preki or Traore that was actually rumor, or no, I think it was Pineda, the one that was heavily rumored with the DC United job, but DC eventually did not weren't able to sign him, and they did not reach an agreement, and he basically stayed as the Sounders assistant coach. But moving on, in terms of the next news, is that Inter Miami has signed Jovan Jones off of free agency from the Seattle Sounders. And Jovan Jones, I thought last year in his second stint with the Sounders, he had an okay year with the Sounders. I mean, he had a decent run in the first half of the season, but then the second half of the season was a total different story where he really started to fall off a cliff. And then probably the lowest point in his Sounders career was that MLS Cup where he, alongside with pretty much the entire team, decided not to show up for that game. And now Inter Miami is kind of taking a gamble and hope that he can rediscover that good form that he had with the Sounders in 2016. And I think it's a good gamble to have because, maybe Jovan Jones, he could potentially rediscover that good form, and that, I know I'm going to use this cliche, but maybe he just needs a change of scenery to kind of rediscover that good form that he had with the Sounders. And also, he is a very good versatile player that can play multiple positions, which, anytime when you're able to sign a player that is versatile and able to play multiple positions, that is definitely an extra bonus and can really help in terms of the depth of your team. So, yeah, overall, I think this is a decent signing for Inter Miami, but also I think, for the Sounders, letting go of Jovan Jones this offseason, I think it was the right decision, knowing the fact that you saw what happened in the second half of the season and also in MLS Cup, where he has really started to fall off a cliff in terms of being used to be one of the best versatile player in the league. Now, RSL has acquired Liga MX winger Anderson Julio on loan from Atlético de San Luis. Now, this guy is a young Ecuadorian winger, also spent time before going to Liga MX in LDU Quito, and from what I heard, he is a very speedy kind of winger, and speed is definitely one of the attribution you definitely look for in a winger, and it's something that a lot of team likes to or a lot of team want their wingers to definitely have. So yeah, overall, I think this is a decent signing for RSL, and a signing that I think they desperately need, knowing the fact that when you look at this attacking depth coming up this season for RSL, yeah, it's not very good, and they're really banking that he is going to be a guy alongside with Damar Kreilach and Albert Rusnak is going to carry this team on the attack for this upcoming season. Now, finally, the last signings to report from these last couple of days involving Atlanta United, who once again signed another player, this time former Orlando City defender Alex Dejan. Now, there was some very interesting thing about this signings that I kind of want to quickly talk about, where, besides the fact that he's been spending his time with Orlando City before, he actually spent his last year with the Pittsburgh Riverhound in the USL. Now, the Pittsburgh Riverhound actually decided to release this guy and pretty much put him onto free agency, which Atlanta was able to get him off of free agency. But then, in a twist of fate, Pittsburgh Riverhound basically decided to ask Atlanta that, you need to pay up for decided to acquire one of our former defender off of free agency. And honestly, I don't know if any of the front office from the Pittsburgh Riverhound, or any person in the front office or the Pittsburgh Riverhound, actually know the whole free agency kind of rules and also transfer rule in general, because I don't think you can basically let go of a player off of free agency and have another team sign him off of free agency only to basically ask them for a transfer fee. Like, if anything, if you decide to ask for a transfer fee, why don't you not let go of him in the first place? Why don't you just basically keep him, and then if Atlanta does decided to get him, then yeah, Atlanta is going to have to forced to make a transfer fee. But because of the fact that they of course let him go off of free agency, they no longer has the rights of him, and once that happened, basically they can't get any transfer fee from that guy. So yeah, I feel like somebody in that front office for the Pittsburgh Riverhound really need to understand how the transfer rule actually work and how the free agency actually work, because it's just very strange that they basically said that, and they literally even tweeted out on their Twitter page, and I just find it kind of hilarious, but at the same time kind of odd that they literally have the audacity to basically release that statement. Now, at the same time, in terms of this signing, yeah, this is just a depth signing for Atlanta. Anytime when I see an MLS team decide to acquire a USL type of player, it's usually for depth reason, and there's not a lot of USL player that have signed with an MLS team and they immediately become starter. Like, the only time that happened is that if a team is desperate in terms of signing a USL player, or maybe this USL player is considered an MLS quality kind of player that is playing in the USL, and then they basically make him as a starter. But even then, it is very rare that of course could happen, especially at this day of age of the league history. But finally, in terms of the last news of this episode, is that Jason Kreis has announced the 20-man roster for the US men's national team CONCACAF Olympic qualifying, and I actually didn't put it here on the board because I ran out of space. So instead, I'm just gonna read you guys the list here, which unfortunately I don't actually have it right here on my phone straight away, so I'm just gonna quickly search here. Let's see. Here it is. All right, so in goalkeeper, you got Matt Freese, JT Marcinkowski, and David Ochoa. And in defender, you have Julian Araujo, Justin Glad, Aaron Herrera, Henry Kessler, Maurizio Pineda, and Sam Vines. In the midfield, you got Johnny Cardoso, Hassani Dotson, Ulises Inez, Jordi Mihailovic, Andres Pereira, Sebastian Saucedo, and Jackson Yu. And then in the forward, you got Jesus Ferreira, Jonathan Lewis, Benji Michel, and Sebastian Soto. So yeah, this is pretty much the roster for the U.S. men's national team CONCACAF Olympic qualifying. And since there's only 20 players that is eligible in this roster, you know that there's going to be a lot of snubs in terms of this roster. And when I look at each position in terms of snub, goalkeeper, I don't really know if there's any snub in terms of that. Obviously, in terms of the goalkeeper position, I think JT Marcinkowski is still the leading candidate to be the starter for this U.S. Olympic qualifying team. But since he did suffer an injury during this off-season, don't be surprised if either David Ochoa or even Matt Freese could potentially take that position away. In defense, obvious name that came into my mind that was an obvious snub is Tanner Tessman, and I believe a lot of people even said that they were shocked to not see Tanner Tessman in as one of the defender, or even as one of the midfielder for this U.S. CONCACAF Olympic qualifying roster, because even though he had limited time in that game against Trinidad and Tobago in that January camp, he looked like a very decent player, and that we already saw what he can do with FC Dallas, and being such a good versatile player and can play in multiple positions. I thought Jason Kreis would think about picking him up and can potentially move him into different role, maybe give more option in terms of certain spot in the defense and also in the midfield. Speaking of the midfield, guys that I think maybe could be a snub that is not on this list, Cole Bassett. I'm really surprised Cole Bassett did not get here, because he had such a breakout year last season, and in general, I'm even surprised he didn't even make it into the January roster, where I thought for sure with him having such a breakout year like that, he's got to be at least in consideration in the January roster for the U.S. men's national team. But that didn't happen, and basically it's not going to happen again here for the roster and him participating in the CONCACAF Olympic qualifying for the U.S. In the forward group, before I talk about snubs, I'm looking at this forward group, and I'm actually a little bit concerned, because when I look at these names like Jesus Ferreira, Jonathan Lewis, Benji Michel, and Sebastian Soto, none of these guys have actually are regular starter for their team. Like Jesus Ferreira, he was in and out with this FC Dallas team last year. Jonathan Lewis, have never been a starter for any team, even though we know he has the quality to do so. Benji Michel, kind of the same thing, not a regular starter for Orlando. And then Sebastian Soto, I believe he's not a regular starter for Norwich at City. So putting a bunch of forward that is not regular starter, and also guys that in this forward group that I don't really know if any of these guys can be that prolific striker that can score the goals for the national team. That does make me a little bit concerned. And this is also where I feel like a possible snub in this forward group has to be Jeremy Abosi, who last year he was a starter for this Timber side, and he continued to show why he is one of the most important number 9 for that Timbers team. And then of course Daryl DK, who I guess maybe the reason why Daryl DK didn't make it is because Barnsley don't want to let go of him to go to this CONCACAF Olympic qualifying. But either way, looking at this forward group, I'm definitely a little concerned about where the goals are going to come from for this U.S. men's national team. And this is kind of not surprising that I asked that question for the U.S. men's national team, or in this case, the Olympic team, because for the past couple of years, that's always been the big question with this U.S. men's national team. Like, we know this team has a decent midfield, and in some way, they also have a decent defense and goalkeeper. But looking up forward, that's when there's some big question, and especially that number 9 position, where I think ever since Landon Donovan and Clint Dempsey no longer become really the guaranteed number 9 and the guy that can definitely bang in the goals for the U.S. men's national team, that hole is still kind of left unfilled, and that I don't think it's going to be left filled again for this Olympic qualifying, or even heading into this upcoming World Cup qualifying, when that number 9 position is still really just up for grabs with the way that we don't know who exactly can play that spot for this upcoming World Cup qualifying. But yeah, there you have it. That is pretty much it for all these news for this episode of News of the Week. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of all of these news? And as always, if there's any news I didn't mention here on the board, let me know in the comments below. But until then, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.